Hello everyone! Well, we've made it to the new year, but I'm still looking back at December for a little while longer. Here's what else I saw last month that I didn't already tell you about. I am afraid this episode might be disappointing for some of you. For one thing, I've got to confess that I did fall asleep on a few of these movies, so my take on them might be a little... For another thing, it was December, Christmas time, the season for watching festive holiday favorites, but I really didn't do a whole lot of that. I did manage to squeeze a few Christmas movies in closer to the end of the month, but I just want to say in advance that this might not be quite what you were expecting. Let's get on with it, shall we? Movie number 1 is a viewer recommendation, 1946's Cluny Brown. Ernst Lubitsch produced and directed this, his last film, a romantic comedy set in pre-war England where Jennifer Jones plays a plumber's niece who has aspirations of entering the trade herself. That notion gets her packed off to the country to learn to be a proper housemaid, but her run-ins with Charles Boyer's suave political refugee keep getting her in trouble. Even being a late-stage Lubitsch film, this has still got some traces of the famous Lubitsch touch. Some dialogue and situations are a little suggestive, pushing the boundaries of the code. There was only one scene I found particularly funny, but it's got a nice supporting cast made up of a host of familiar character actors like Reginald Owen, Una O'Connor, Richard Hayden, Reginald Gardner, and C. Aubrey Smith. A young Peter Lawford co-stars. He's not very interesting. I found Jennifer Jones's working-class British accent a bit dodgy, and in general, her performance is over the top. But bear in mind, I've never been a huge fan of hers. Her character also seems too young for her love interests, even though Jones herself was about 27, not as young as the character seems. Boyer is fine. I was most impressed by how clearly he said the word squirrel. It comes up more than you would think, and despite his ubiquitous French accent, he never struggles with the word the way the French typically do. You've probably picked up on this already, but I wasn't crazy about this one. I did nod off toward the end, but even before that, the story and characters just weren't that appealing to me, and I didn't find the romance or the resolution convincing. The thing is, I'm not sure I was supposed to. The tone is so cheeky that it felt like it was intended to be ridiculous, but it's vague enough as a parody that I wasn't sure what to think. Movie number 2 is 1964's The Seventh Dawn, in which William Holden has survived the war in Malaysia and become a rubber plantation tycoon. But when communist uprisings lead to acts of terrorism against his fellow businessmen, and the British pressure him to use his connection to one of the leaders to intervene, he reluctantly agrees. The film also stars Susanna York and Capucine, and I've gotta be honest, I didn't really dig this one either. I found it hard to get into the plot, I didn't really care for the characters much, I found Susanna York's flirty ingenue annoying, and I had trouble buying Holden's... never mind, that's kind of a spoiler. And then I started falling asleep, and that was the kiss of death. I tried to fight it, my mom kept yelling at me, but I just couldn't help myself. After a little power nap, I did come back, and, I saw enough to understand that the last 15 minutes were pretty tense, but I'd kind of lost track of what was going on, so it was not nearly as impactful as it should have been. So I really can't give a fair assessment of this film, but I didn't enjoy the first half of this movie enough to want to go back and pick up whatever I might have missed. We've had pre-war, post-war, now here's one that's mid-war. Movie number 3 is 2004's In Enemy Hands. When an American sub is torpedoed by a German U-boat, another German captain chooses to take the survivors aboard as prisoners, unaware that one of them has contracted meningitis. As the fatal disease begins to spread in the cramped quarters, tensions between enemies escalate, but others try to find a way for both sides to make it out of the situation alive. This one starts off a little clunky, it's got kind of a 90s TV movie feel, but the story and character development are good, and that makes up for a certain lack of polish. Most of the cast is solid. William H. Macy starring as chief of the boat, serving under a much younger, less experienced commanding officer. That captain is played by Scott Conn, son of James Conn, and unfortunately, he is not good. He looks way too bro for the time period, and his acting is so wooden. I hate to say this, but he was a terrible fit for the part. Just bad. But everyone else is fine. The highlights, besides Macy, are the two main German officers, played by Til Schweiger and Thomas Kretschmann, who is always a pleasure to watch. There are also early roles for Clark Gregg, Xander Berkeley, and Ian Somerhalder. I definitely got some U-571 vibes from this. That movie came out just a couple years earlier, and it also co-starred Thomas Kretschmann. There's also some recognizable footage from old movies, which really stuck out. But otherwise, this was a good film, and I actually really enjoyed it. The layers of conflict made for a great story. Now, number 4 is a big one, so buckle up. It's the 1966-67 Soviet adaptation of War and Peace, Leo Tolstoy's massive novel about 3 people caught up in turbulent times revolving around Napoleon's war with Russia. I was unfamiliar with this 6.5-hour-long epic until last year or the year before when I came across a clip of Natasha and Andrei's waltz. The scene was so lush and vibrant that I thought, I need to see this movie. I read the book ages ago, and I saw the 1956 adaptation a couple years after that, though it has 2 actors I especially like, Audrey Hepburn and Herbert Lom as Napoleon. I remember finding it a lackluster production on the whole. This version, released as 4 individual films, was a concerted effort by the Soviet Union to compete with the 1956 American film and to adapt War and Peace, as they saw it, the right way. The result is a magnificent production with beautiful visuals and art design, breathtaking camera work. The prolonged battle sequences are stunningly complex. They cover so much ground, there's so much happening, and all these moving parts are brilliantly choreographed. And the battles are given as much time and care as the sumptuous ballroom scenes. On full display is the opulence of Imperial Russia, made even more impressive with a sweeping musical score and some mind-blowing visual effects. But I had a hard time connecting with the characters. I don't know if it's a cultural thing or just the way these particular actors tended to emote, but there was an exaggeration and artificiality there that kept me at a distance. This quartet of films is a dazzling achievement, I want to stress that, but it's a lot to take in, and there's a lot you should know beforehand about historical and cultural context. And while I liked War and Peace, the book, a lot, it's a much easier and more entertaining read than people make it sound. It has been a long time since I read it, and I don't think my mom was familiar with the story at all, so it would have been easier for both of us if we had watched an English-language adaptation first, gotten a feel for things, and then approached this with more familiarity. There are also lengthy scenes where not much is actually happening, but it's nice to look at. I didn't dislike this. In many ways, it was really good, and it was impeccably made. There were sequences I marveled at. But it also left me feeling kind of cold, and that was disappointing. Movie number 5 is, oh my goodness, another war movie. To those of you who don't care for the war movies, I'm so sorry. This one is 1949's Task Force, a nondescript title that gives you zero hint that the movie is about the development of American aircraft carriers. Gary Cooper stars as a pilot who advocates for Naval Air Corps, sometimes at the expense of his own career. This film covers quite a large span of time. Not much effort is made to de-age Cooper for the scenes where he's supposed to be a much younger man, but despite that, he's very good, as are his co-stars, Jane Wyatt and Walter Brennan. This was the last of 8 films, I believe, that Cooper and Brennan did together. Turner Classic Movies aired this on December 7th in honor of Pearl Harbor, which was perfect because I was looking for a Pearl Harbor movie that I hadn't seen before. There are several films that commemorate that event, event in greater detail or with fancier effects, but the sequence here was quite good. The most astonishing thing about the film, which came as a total surprise to me because I didn't read up on it beforehand, is that it features a transition from black and white to color. It's a gradual shift, starting with a dark, almost mysterious shot that made me squint at the TV and wonder if the slight brownish hue was just my imagination. It makes the change in steady increments, easing the viewer into Technicolor, which allowed the filmmakers to keep the archive material from the US Navy in its original pristine color. I thought this was a great rearrangement of priorities, showing the real footage to best advantage and shooting the rest of the film in a way that would match it and showcase it. Movie number 6 is 1945's The Southerner. Zachary Scott and Betty Field star as a married couple struggling to make it on their own cotton farm despite hostile circumstances, bad weather, and unfriendly neighbors. When I did a video a while back on the obscure 1961 adaptation of Jane Eyre, I talked a bit about Zachary Scott, who played Rochester in that version. Up to that point, I'd only ever seen him play smarmy types, so seeing him as Rochester was very different, and I thought he was pretty good. One of my viewers gave this film and his performance in it a ringing endorsement in the comments, and after looking it up, I really wanted to see it. The Southerner was directed by renowned French director Jean Renoir, who's most known for directing Grand Illusion and The Rules of the Game. But in this case, Renoir managed to make a film that is quintessentially American, about the trials of working the land and being an independent farmer in the South. One of its most enjoyable aspects is its depiction of a happily married couple, devoted to their children and crazy about each other, with infidelity not even a remote possibility. Though neither star is glamorously dressed or made up, they have a wholesome, natural attractiveness. Yeah, Scott's pretty hot here in the rugged farmer, loving husband, affectionate father role, and he wears his sleeves rolled up for at least half the movie. On the flip side, there were a couple minor sources of irritation. Number one, Beulah Bondi as the grandmother lays it on way too thick. She should be a sympathetic character, it wouldn't take much, but when you see an old woman squabbling with a 6-year-old and throwing a tantrum when she doesn't get her way, it's off-putting. Number two, this is the kind of story where you see a character making a risky decision and you're like, oh no, and then you're just waiting for it to bite them in the butt. Not that this is a tale of one blunder after another, and many of the things that go wrong are beyond anyone's control, and often the worst does not happen. But you feel like it will. Movie number 7 is one that's been recommended a couple times, but I already had it on my radar, 1992's A Midnight Clear. It's a World War II story about an American reconnaissance group tramping around the Ardennes forest in December 1944, trying to maintain morale as they're tasked with securing an abandoned house and keeping it from the Germans. Finally, we've got a Christmas movie on the list! Except if you're in the mood for a cheery Christmas story, this ain't it. This is depressing. I'm not saying it wasn't a good story, but oof, what a downer. There were also a number of events that required a good stretch of the imagination, and one sequence that I could have done without. The cast includes Ethan Hawke, Gary Sinise, Kevin Dillon, and John C. McGinley as a nasty major. This is one of those cases where it's a good movie, it's well made, it's well acted, all of that. I just didn't enjoy it. A couple years ago, I reviewed Joyeux Noël, which has some overlap with this story, and I enjoyed that film better. I also did a review, maybe in the same video, of a movie from 2003, I think, called Fallen Angel, which is also a somber, Christmassy movie that stars Gary Sinise. And there's another Christmas movie I've talked about in the past that has this same Belgian forest, December 44 setting where American soldiers end up in a house. The cabin is owned by a German woman who's played by Linda Hamilton. I can't for the life of me remember what this movie's called. I think The The title comes from the lyrics of a Christmas Carol. Anyway, that was good too, and all of these are kind of heavy Christmas movies that I enjoyed more than A Midnight Clear. Movie number 8 is one I picked because it was short, 1956's Operation Cicero, a 1-hour TV adaptation of the 1952 film Five Fingers, which I talked about last year. Ricardo Montalban takes on the role of a British ambassador's butler who is selling state secrets to the Germans in Turkey. Naturally, to account for Montalban's accent, they changed the butler's backstory, but for the most part, it's a very close approximation of the feature-length film. Scenes and camera setups are nearly identical, and a few exterior shots may have even been repurposed from the original. This is a great example of how to condense a story for a smaller medium. I couldn't tell you what they left out because it seemed to me all the essential stuff was still there. The main difference is in the performances, and dare I say it, while I agree that James Mason is excellent in the role, I liked Ricardo Montalban just as much, if not better. His buttling is smooth and his propositions are slick. His scheming, double-crossing manservant has a little more reason for the chip on his shoulder. He was less creepy in a certain scene, and I felt greater sympathy for him when he revealed his motivation. When it comes to the supporting cast, though, the original is superior hands down. While this abridged version boasts Peter Lorre, his part is disappointingly small, and the actors playing the Countess and the counter-espionage agent did not make a strong impression. Obviously, Five Fingers is the definitive adaptation. But if you're interested in another take, or you don't have time to watch an entire film but are curious about the story, I'd say this one's worth a look. Movie number 9 is 1977's It Happened One Christmas, a made-for-TV spin on It's a Wonderful Life that stars Marlo Thomas in the lead role of Mary Bailey, who sacrifices her dream of traveling the world to rescue her father's building and loan business from the clutches of Mr. Potter, played here with a cunning gleam by the ever-delightful Orson Welles. The cast also includes Wayne Rogers as George Hatch and Cloris Leachman as the doddering angel Clara. I can't remember how I found this. I don't think it was a viewer recommendation, but I was under the impression it was a modern retelling with a woman in the lead role, sort of like the adaptation of A Christmas Carol starring Susan Lucci that I saw a million years ago, which surprisingly was pretty good, at least as I remember it. So, when I realized this was actually a near shot-for-shot remake with Mary and George switching places, I was kind of disappointed. It does turn out to be a pretty good film, though. The emotional beats are all there, and Marlo Thomas, under quite a bit of pressure, I assume, does a fine job. There are a few significant changes, and with everything else being copy and paste, I had to wonder why they chose to change these things and not others. I was curious to see how they'd handle certain issues that arise from the gender swap. It's 1928, so wouldn't everyone in town be shocked to see an 18-year-old girl taking over her father's business? And would they make George a stay-at-home dad in a time when that really wasn't a thing? As it turns out, they sort of just avoid discussing these contextual oddities, which is an interesting choice. There are definitely parts the original film did better, like the Charleston scene and the telephone scene. They're both pretty lame here. But for the most part, it keeps up. I think some of the protagonist's most frustrated and anguished scenes come across differently when played by a woman. When Mary starts shaking her uncle, or when she comes home and freaks out at her family, it's more startling, and the look on Mary's face when she's on the verge of losing it and she's trying to force the petals back onto the flower, I felt that. Since It's a Wonderful Life really isn't one of my favorite Christmas movies, though I always feel compelled to give it an obligatory mention because it is a very good film, I have no problem with this alternate version existing. It's not perfect, but it's a competent remake that adds something fresh through certain key changes and the main role switcheroo. Movie number 10. Remember I bought that Apple TV Plus subscription so that I could watch that show, Monarch Legacy of Monsters, which has turned out to be pretty disappointing. I can't wait till it's over. And I was supposed to be watching anything else that looked interesting while I had the subscription. Well, we've gone through 9 movies on this list already, and none of them were on that app, so that gives you an indication of how that went. I should have known I wouldn't make any progress. It was December. Horrendous timing. It's the worst time to try to do this sort of thing. I didn't watch a single thing on that app besides 2 episodes of Monarch, the first 2 episodes of Silo, and this, movie number 10, 2022's Spirited. Will Ferrell and Ryan Reynolds star in this quirky take on A Christmas Carol, giving it a modern and musical spin and approaching the concept from a wildly different angle. It's very creative in its ideas and plot development, with tons of unexpected turns and cinematic trickery, where you think it's going one way and then it says, nope, we're doing something else. I knew Ryan Reynolds and Will Ferrell could sing, but it was still impressive to see them embrace the song and dance thing with so much gusto. They don't hold back here, and they both act their parts well enough, playing extreme versions either of themselves or of the kinds of roles they're known for. Now, I vividly remember hearing about this movie when it was in production, because the concept was so interesting to me, and Ryan Reynolds is a marketing genius, so I looked forward to checking it out someday. I was taken aback, therefore, when at last I got my chance, and I found myself struggling to get into it. The sense of humor feels excruciatingly 2022 to me, and the dialogue is delivered at a pace I found hard to keep up with. Everything moves fast. Effects, comedic moments, sad moments, transitions in and out of musical numbers. At 2 hours and 7 minutes, it's kind of a long movie, but it still felt like they were rushing to cram everything in. I could say it would have been better if they had slowed the pace down, but then the movie would have been even longer, and that wouldn't have been good. So instead, it might have been more manageable if they'd cut, 2 or 3 or 4 musical numbers and taken out 5 to 8% of the jokes. There are an awful lot of songs, and none of them stuck with me. While I was watching, I was reminded of The Greatest Showman, and so it was no big surprise when I found out afterward that the music and lyrics were written by the same team, Benj Pasek and Justin Paul, who did The Greatest Showman and Dear Evan Hansen. And in my opinion, those are 2 of the blandest, most generic musicals that have come out in the last decade. And the music here is more of the same. It's decent for a moment, but ultimately it becomes repetitive and prolonged, and it's forgettable. The look of it reminded me of The Greatest Showman as well, and it was certainly an enormous spectacle, but it was weird. Some of the effects were wowing, but there was also a sense of cheapness, and sometimes it more closely resembled a taped stage musical than a real movie. Was that intentional? After a rough start, I did eventually warm up to the movie about 45 minutes in, but even then, the jokes were hit or miss, and the tone wasn't always right, especially when they would suddenly throw in a dramatic moment. Anytime something serious happened, it felt like it was still a joke, or would turn into a joke, because everything else was treated so irreverently. I did find myself laughing out loud a few times as the movie wound up to its crazy climax, but there were things that just didn't hit right. And I also wasn't totally on board with the film's message. I will say Octavia Spencer's singing was a pleasant surprise, and I enjoyed Patrick Page's novel take on a friendly Jacob Marley, who got even more tired of the song breaks than I did. The Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come was fun, and I enjoyed the layers of meta jokes and references. Well, some of them. My most prominent takeaway, unfortunately, is that this movie made me feel old. Old and tired. As much as I was looking forward to it before, and I've wanted to see it all this time, and I did end up liking it sometimes, I don't imagine I'll be wanting to see it again, and I don't foresee it becoming an enduring classic. Movie number 11 is 1949's Mr. Soft Touch. Glenn Ford stars as a war veteran returned home to find that a gangster has taken over his nightclub. He steals back the money that's rightfully his, but now they're after him, so he has to lay low until he can catch a boat out of the country. Trouble is, he hides out in a settlement home where impoverished people of all ages reside, and he finds himself roped into helping them set up their Christmas fundraiser, simultaneously falling for Evelyn Key's straight-laced social worker. Genre-wise, this one's a little all over the place. Is it a noir, a comedy, a romance? But I really liked it. I never think of Glenn Ford as a comic actor, but he does some really funny bits here. The way he bumbles around with other actors, the sets, and the props feels natural. It isn't an all-out knee-slapper because it does have pretty dark elements and has, I think, an inconclusive ending, but it has some very jolly parts, and Ford even gets to don a Santa suit. I don't know how other people feel about this one, I've never heard anyone mention it, but to me, the mix of humor, romance, and crime makes it an entertaining, offbeat, underrated Christmas film. Movie number 12 is 1995's While You Were Sleeping, a romantic comedy set in Chicago at Christmas time that stars Sandra Bullock and Bill Pullman. When Bullock's lonely token collector Lucy sees her crush, a complete stranger, get pushed onto the tracks, she saves him from being hit by an oncoming train. But while he's in a coma, a misunderstanding leads his family to believe that Lucy is his fiancée, and as they eagerly welcome her into their home, she finds herself unable to tell them the truth. I love this film. It's one of my favorite Christmas movies. I've seen it many times since I was a little kid. It's a favorite of my mom's. It's a favorite of both my sisters, going way back. So I really don't know how to evaluate it without just gushing over it. But I think it deserves the praise. It's a great movie. The casting is perfect in every way. I would say this is Sandra Bullock's most endearing role. She is charming and relatable, as is her co-star Bill Pullman as her fake fiancé Peter's suspicious brother Jack, and they have great chemistry. And they're bolstered by a fantastic supporting cast. There's not an off performance or a lackluster performance in the whole thing. Every person is a character, whether we're talking about the pitch-perfect family members, Lucy's exasperated boss, her landlord's gross son Joe Jr., Ashley Bartlett Bacon, Peter's enthusiastic roommate, the overly helpful nurse. Even the hot dog stand guy has personality. The script is delightfully funny, with lines we have been quoting for years, like, "These mashed potatoes are so creamy," "Beef and Nazis," "Do I like Jell-O?" And a really big favorite, "Don't start eating cookies and cakes, or else you'll blow up like my Aunt Roberta." I don't know why everything that comes to mind is food-related. We've always had a good laugh over the family's disjointed dinner conversation, and also been quick to observe whenever our own dinner conversation was following that trajectory. But it's important to note that the film's sense of humor and whimsy never gets in the way of significant, heartfelt moments. You really feel for Lucy as she goes from a pathetic situation to one that's an absolute mess. And even though it's obvious that she should have spoken up right away and this whole thing could have been avoided, you understand why she didn't, and then you understand why she doesn't want to. Has the movie aged? Sure, in some ways, I guess I'll concede that. The hair, the fashion, the decor, the plaid. Although, honestly, a lot of this stuff has been back in the past couple years, so it doesn't look as dated as you would think. But in most respects, it's timeless. And after this many years, I feel confident saying it will always be one of my favorite movies to watch at Christmas time, or New Year's, or really any time of the year. And movie number 13 is one we were able to squeeze in before the holiday season ended, 1942's Alias Boston Blackie. In this installment of the Boston Blackie series, Chester Morris's titular hero brings a group of performers to a prison to entertain the inmates for Christmas. But when one prisoner uses the show as an opportunity to escape, and the police pin the blame on Blackie, it's up to him to find the fugitive and get everything straightened out. It's not the most Christmassy movie in the world, but Blackie does decorate a tree in a couple scenes, and there are plenty of entertaining hijinks, chases, and clothing swaps. There's a Santa Claus in there. Of the 14 Boston Blackie movies, this is only the second or third that I've seen, so I'm not familiar with all the side characters, but I can tell that they're a winsome, likable lot. The way the plot wraps up is somewhat dizzying, but the runtime is only about an hour, and for the most part, I think that time is judiciously spent. And if the story itself gets a little sloppy in the final act, well, it's not such a big deal. Ultimately, I had a good time with this one. And that wraps up everything else I saw in December, so we can now close the book on 2023. I hope you enjoyed this collection of mini reviews. The titles I mentioned can be found listed in the description, along with a note about where I watched them. Any thoughts you have on any of these movies, you are welcome to share in the comments below, and I'll be back next week. Thanks for watching.